Welcome to Black Hat Windows Security Conference 2002, held February 7th through the 9th in New Orleans, Louisiana. The following videotape was recorded live at the conference and produced by the Sound of Knowledge Incorporated.
Here, even though I'm told the coffee line is still long. My name is Jesper Johansson. I work at Microsoft, and I'm going to talk about basically a paper that I wrote with Matt Bishop at the University of California, where we're talking about something called intermittently connected clients. With some trepidation, looking forward to talking for an hour and a half, given the fact that I've got a cold and I don't know how long my voice will last, but we'll see how well it goes here. This paper came out of a number of realizations that kept me up for long periods of time at night, and it still does, because unfortunately, I wasn't able to give a solution at the end of the paper. I give a kind of a straw man solution, but I don't have a great solution to give. And so this is more a wake-up call and something to frighten people than actually something where we give a solution. Basically, what it is that keeps me awake at night is these things. How many of you got one of these? Okay, quite a few. A bunch of you have notebooks. Everybody work at a company that has a dial-in system, RAS, VPN, something like that? Okay. The problem basically is that it used to be really nice and clear-cut. We could say, this is our network. It starts here, it ends here, here's the perimeter, okay? We can't say that any longer. We really can't. With these various kinds of edge devices that we sometimes don't really control, we don't know where the network ends any longer. And that's a really frightening thing from a security perspective. So that's what I wanted to talk about. I called them intermittently connected clients. And what is an intermittently connected client? It's something that is connected to the network for periods of time and then disconnects. It's not completely connected. It's not always on the network. Examples are notebooks, handheld computers, palm tops, PDAs, to a certain extent cell phones, as those get more powerful. But also, think about home computers that are dialed into the company. Or even home computers that are on a home network that also has sometimes a notebook that is a company computer. Okay, so you got your work notebook, you bring that home, hook it up to your home LAN, you have home computers there, your kids' computers, whatever. Those then become essentially these intermittently connected clients. So we have all kinds of things. Other examples which people don't think about a lot is conference computer centers. If you're right now sitting with the wireless LAN here and you're VPN'd into the company, guess what? Everybody else in this wireless LAN is potentially a client on your corporate network. Did you think about that before you dialed in? They said in the little handout that you should consider this traffic sniffed. I think you should probably consider this network completely hostile. And if you start from that assumption, I think you'll be a lot better off. Conference computer centers are really frightening. When I first installed, it must have been Windows 2000, I was sitting at a conference computer center at some point, and all of a sudden I get a little dialog box pops up in the lower right corner of the screen saying, the computer hackers are us, is trying to send files to you. Click here to accept the file, evilvirus.exe. Oh, what in the world's going on? Turns out I had the infrared connector on. The infrared port was on, and it picked up some other computer sitting on the other side of this table that was trying to send viruses to me. That's kind of handy. Kiosk systems at conferences are very often used to dial into company networks. Do you know what's on that kiosk system? Do you know who used it last? I don't know. It's a frightening setup, and a lot of it is really scary because not only do we not have control over them, these machines very often do not have the security capabilities of the machines that we do have control over. What kind of things do we usually do in companies to secure our networks? Authentication is, in some cases, the be-all and end-all of security. In other cases, it's just one component. Hopefully, in your case, it's just one component of it. Passwords, and I would really like to see us go to passphrases instead of passwords. In general, when I do penetration testing, I can crack 70 to 80% of the passwords overnight. In really bad situations, I'll crack every single non-machine generated password overnight. That's frightening. That's only happened once, but that's really scary. Okay. Passphrases are much, much better, and with Windows 2000 XP, you can actually use passwords that are longer than 14 characters, and you'll get an awful lot of benefit out of doing so. They get to be a lot more difficult to crack just because of the sheer length of them. The other option is smart cards, and actually even biometric devices. How many of you have seen these URU personal little biometric for Windows XP? Have you seen those? They're really cool. It's a little box, and it's got a fingerprint reader on it. And if you use Windows XP, either home or professional that's not joined to a domain, you just put your finger on it, and it logs you on. If you have this fast user switching and somebody else is logged on, you put your finger on it, it switches to your user account. It's really cool. Do you know how they store the fingerprint? What they actually do is they take your fingerprint, they store basically a numeric representation of it in the registry on the machine, along with an obfuscated version of the password. Okay? So you put your finger on this thing, it reads the obfuscated version of your cleartext password out of the registry and essentially fills in the box for you. That's basically what they do. Cute. Really sweet. Smart cards is a little bit different, and you can actually implement biometric devices as a smart card type device, but that's not what they did in this case. It's a cool thing to use for home use. I wouldn't recommend it anywhere else. How many of you work for companies that have ID badges required for going into the company? Okay. Do you get smart cards on your badges? Do you? Okay. That's starting to become more the norm now, actually, than the exception. So that helps a lot. Access control. How many of you have tweaked the ACLs on your machines? Access control lists on your machines? 2, 3, 4. Wow. Oh, that's sad. That's one of the best things when I do penetration testing is most of the time the ACLs haven't been tweaked at all. Makes it a lot easier to take over a machine. Now think about most of these intermittently connected clients. What kind of access control list can you set on this? Not much, right? How do you control access control lists on your employees' home computers? The answer is you don't. Firewalls. I'm hoping all of you have firewalls. I spent the last 12 years in academia where it's really interesting. You hear things like, oh, we don't need a firewall, we have Kerberos. Let me think about that one for a second. But for how many of you is the firewall the last line of defense? Okay, now think about intermittently connected clients which are not inside the firewall. Okay. That doesn't help any. Virtual private networks. Virtual private networks is a security measure, but they also enable another entry point into the organization. And that's really important to remember when you're putting one of those up. We've been very worried about modems for a long time. And a lot of organizations do war dialing now. Do you do war dialing on your network to find rogue modems? Yeah. Do you do VPN war dialing to find employees that have set up VPN dial-ins on their own? Most organizations don't. Okay, it's another entry point into your organization that you don't control. Let's talk about these ICCs in this context. The basic purpose of these things is mobility, is to use organizational information while you're not at the organizational network. Essentially, you take the information, you download it, and you leave the network. Or you connect into the network from the outside. Mobile work is a big deal. It's a huge area, and it's just going to get a lot bigger. It's also going to create all kinds of interesting security problems for us. I was looking at, I was asked for some help on an Access database. Somebody said, could you just help me with this little program? And I said, sure, no problem. And I sit down in front of her notebook, and she was not at the company. I sit down in front of her notebook, and look at our database, and so there's names in here, in this database. Yeah, and I looked more at it, and there was addresses. Names, addresses, employee ID numbers. Scroll over a little bit, and I find salaries. I'm like, what is this? Is this the HR database? Yeah. Wait a minute. You took your HR database and downloaded it to your notebook and left the company. Yeah. What portion of it? The whole thing. And what are you running on your notebook? I don't know. I looked. It was the original release of Windows 95. The one that will volunteer usernames and passwords in clear text if you just ask it. So what kind of protection do you have for your corporate HR database? It's probably pretty difficult to get to it inside the company, but why do I bother when there's an essentially unsecured machine connected to the internet on the outside that has the entire thing on it? That's the kind of thing that we're enabling with mobile work. That's the kind of things that these intermittently connected clients enable. That's what we have to protect. Mostly the information on these ICCs is a little bit more benign, though. Primarily, we're looking at things like contacts, calendars, email, to some extent documents, but I can put SQL Server on this. There's a SQL Server for Windows CE. I can synchronize against the corporate SQL Server database. The power of these things is far outpacing the security measures that we're taking on them. And that's something to think about. Organizational credentials are on these. Passwords, smart card information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Phone numbers, VPN server dial-in connections. All of that stuff is usually available on mobile clients. Okay. I can probably port scan your network and your firewall and find your VPN servers, but it's probably a lot easier for me to break into your employees' home computers and find them from there. That's probably a lot easier. It's also much less likely to be detected. If I port scan your entire network looking for the dial-in systems, that's something you're likely to see. What kinds of security exposure is it that we can see? I'm going to spend a good part of the presentation talking about what kinds of things is it that you got to worry about when you're dealing with these types of clients. Ordered roughly in the order of the seriousness. Hardrick Compromise is probably the simplest one. We then have data tampering, modifying data that's on these things. Data theft, which is essentially being able to read the data. And I'll explain later why I think that's more serious than data tampering. Aggregation, which is an interesting concept in and of itself. Software tampering, and then lastly vectoring, and I'll talk about vectoring at some length. It's a very interesting concept. Think about it this way. If you've been flying a lot after September 11, you've obviously noticed that security has gotten a lot better. It used to be that just anybody could walk through the security checkpoints at the airport. You didn't have to be flying or anything, you just walked through, right? And there were actually gangs of people that had developed this incredible system for stealing computers at the security checkpoints. They would wait till somebody put their notebook on the band, and then right after they did that, they would run up and just crowd in front of them, run through the checkpoint, pick up the notebook on the other end, and take off. Okay? It was actually bands of people that were doing this. Now that's gotten a little bit more difficult with the additional security because you now supposedly anyway have to fly to be able to get through the security checkpoint. Now as it turns out, I was sitting on the plane yesterday and I was looking at, I couldn't remember when we were supposed to arrive, so I brought up my itinerary and looked at it. And something was really strange. It said New York at the end of it. It's like a flight from Seattle to New York. Thinking that doesn't make any sense. It turns out that was the itinerary for my trip to New York last week. That was what I used to get through the security checkpoint yesterday morning. So apparently, as long as you have a paper that has your name printed somewhere on it, you can get through the security checkpoints. Okay, so we probably haven't gotten away from that problem still. It's an interesting concept. But Hardrick Compromise is primarily done by opportunistic types of criminals. These are people that really don't care whether it's your notebook or somebody else's notebook they're going to steal. They're just going to steal some notebook because they can sell the notebook. They don't particularly care about the information on it. Now, if somebody goes after Bill Gates or Andy Grove's notebook, then they might do so because they care about the information on it. But if they go after my notebook, that's probably not the reason they steal it. Okay? So it's fairly simple-minded attack. Now, again, I don't have this, but Andy Grove supposedly has bodyguards for his notebook. He's got 2 bodyguards, one for himself, one for his computer. And as he moves away from his computer, the bodyguard moves closer to it. It's amazing to see him give a speech. He moves away from the microphone, and the bodyguard moves closer to where his computer is. It's really, really kind of incredible. Most of us don't have that kind of protection for our machines, though. But Hardrick Compromise is a fairly simple-minded thing, and I'll talk about some mitigation measures for that later on. Data tampering is kind of the next level. Data tampering is essentially, at least to some extent, access without reading. You don't necessarily need to be able to read the data to tamper with it. Tampering ranges from preventing you from actually legitimately using the data to actually modifying it. Think about it this way. On this instance where the corporate HR database was in an unprotected notebook outside the company, I may not be able to read it, but maybe I could find a way to add myself to it. That'd be cool. I'm now an employee of the company. Send checks to P.O. Box 1473. Do you have auditing for those kinds of things? How do you detect that? If the information is later synchronized with the master copy, how do you detect legitimate changes that were made while it was used offline? And how do you detect illegitimate changes that were used offline? Modification very often is more damaging than destruction. You rarely use a single copy of the data on the ICCs. In other words, the ICC usually has a copy of the data, not the single copy of it. So in other words, if somebody destroys data that I've downloaded to this thing, okay, I reconnect to the network, download it again, right? But if somebody modifies data that's on this, that's more serious because that will then get replicated into the corporate database. That's actually a form of vectoring. I'm using this to get into a system that I otherwise couldn't get into. Okay? Destroying the entire system technically would fall into the category of data tampering. If I can just completely host your system so that you have to do a hard reset and lose everything that was on it, that's essentially data tampering. But that falls in the category of stupid DOS tricks, and largely, even with Windows, we've now gone away from that as the main vector of attack. It's really funny, though, because we were asked to do another one of these kind of open hack contests. Put a beta system out on the internet and say, here's this beta system of .NET Server, go attack it. We did that with Windows 2000. That was actually before I joined Microsoft. But we did that with Windows 2000, and what happened? Well, a lot of people started beating their heads against it and finally figured out that they couldn't break it and then started DOSing it instead. It's kind of the last resort when you figured you can't break into something, then you start doing denial of service attacks instead. If you followed the news on the World Economic Forum that was in New York last week, that was basically what the attacks ended up being. They were unable, at least as far as we know, to get into the network, so they just decided to DOS the entire system instead and prevent everybody else from using it. It's a last resort kind of attack. But it still happens, and it's still serious, but nowhere near as serious as if you can actually modify things. Going into more interesting things, data theft. This is kind of the extreme end of data tampering. And the reason I think it's more serious than data tampering is because data tampering, at least I have a possibility of detecting. I can detect whether somebody modified data on the system. When it gets synchronized up to the master database, I can detect that things have changed. But if somebody simply read it while it was on an unprotected client, how do I detect that? What kind of information could they read? What kinds of things could they get that's useful? Salaries would be one thing. Sales information would be another. If I can get a hold of your client list, that could be very useful. For those of us who do pen testing, how many of you do pen testing? Okay, I'm sure you have a wares directory sitting somewhere on your machine, right? Where all the evil wares are. And standard set of tools are always in there, PW dump, LSA dump, and a few of those. Those we all have. Those aren't all that interesting. But what about all of the really interesting stuff that you've custom developed for things that you've done in the past? Those would be very useful to me. How would you detect that I've read that? Unless you have auditing on for reading, you won't. And even then, you may not even see it because I may read it as you. That's not something you can easily detect. So data theft is really kind of difficult to see. Also, the other thing to keep in mind with data theft is that if I'm going to go after data on your system, I'm probably doing so for a particular reason. And it's not so that I can hack a computer and buy more crack, right? People that go after data on your system are usually a lot more sophisticated than the ones that would steal the entire computer, right? So this could get really, really bad. And you really have to think about what people can do with the data and take appropriate measures to protect it. And I'm going to talk about a technique later on which can be used. It's a straw man, but it's a technique to deal with this kind of an issue, at least protect somewhat against it. The kind of examples we have of data theft, there's lots of interesting ones. RF interception has been one of those things. I was talking to the NSA gentleman that did the keynote just before I started talking about my topic, and we were talking about RF interception, and that's something the NSA has been very, very concerned with in the last many years. Is somebody sitting with a real powerful radio receiver in the parking lot outside the company and reading things that are coming off the screens. I think we've all heard of Tempest, right? And you have these Tempest certified monitors that don't give off any RF interference. You use shielded cable for your networking and so on and so forth. And Tempest monitors are actually used in a fair number of companies, but I had this really interesting experience with my wife's company. They put on this financial planning seminar for employees. It was one of those free deals that you get to go to at night. And I had never been at the company, so I thought it was an interesting thing to go to just because of that. And we're walking through the parking lot, and there's a sidewalk, and there's all kinds of offices along the sidewalk. And one of the things I noticed was that every single employee in those offices had their monitor turned away or toward the street so that they could sit with their back toward the window, so they could more easily read the monitor. They all had huge monitors in engineering companies. They all had huge monitors, and almost every one of them was open to their email inbox. So I'm walking by the windows at this company at 6:30 at night, reading people's emails as I'm walking by. What good is shielding the monitor interference going to do then, right? People can actually counteract a lot of technical things that we do to protect our systems, and that's something to keep in mind too. This RF interference is going to get a lot more interesting with 802.11, but there are other things as well. Airports. How much useful information could you gain from just sitting on the airplane reading what people have on their screens? You know, it's really funny. I almost went up to a guy last week and said, you know, you've misspelled the heading on your first slide there. You know, he had this great presentation, and it was this big sales pitch. Very first slide had the heading misspelled. There's actually new TFTs now, new thin film transistor monitors, which actually prevent viewing from an angle. Remember back when notebooks first came out and we had these horrible passive matrix LCDs? Unless you were right in front of it, you couldn't read it. It went green and yellow and was really, really ugly. And in my case, it was the only way I could get any color on my machine. It was a totally black and white monitor, but it was just really ugly. And then these active matrix monitors came out, and one of the big sales pitches was, you can read it from any angle. All of a sudden, some rocket scientists realized that's not always a good thing. So now they're selling these shielding devices that you can either clip onto your monitor or they're built into the monitor that actually prevent viewing from an angle. So we're kind of come full circle on that one now, which I think is kind of funny. But just flying on the airplanes, you can pick up a lot of interesting information. I know after that one, I know everything about selling cement, because that's what this guy did. Just way more than I wanted to know about it. This is one of those really funny ones. Browser frame domain verification. And in a sense, this is kind of like the wolf guard in the hen house, because Microsoft has had its fair share of problems in this area. In all fairness, not that other browsers haven't, but we've certainly had enough of them. The basic idea is you're surfing the web or you're reading your email. Can one web browser window read what's in another window? No, they shouldn't be able to, but the fact is they often can. That's frame domain verification. How do you verify who can read what on the screen? Can I open one window on your computer that reads all the other windows on your computer? That's frame domain verification. It's one way to do data theft. It's kind of difficult because you got to know exactly what it is you're going after to do anything useful with it. But I could do some interesting things with it, like steal your credentials for some other system. And that might actually be more useful than simply reading, the test.txt file that's stored in the root of your C drive, which is usually what all the sample exploits do. Now to my personal favorite, 802.11b, wireless networking. 802.11b was really what gave us usable wireless networking. Oh, okay. Gods don't like that. Do you allow 802.11b in your company? Anybody that doesn't? You don't. Where do you work?
ICCs laboratories.
Oh, okay. And you don't allow it? Cool. Cool. I think MITRE has also banned it. Anybody at MITRE? No? I think MITRE banned it too. Yeah?
There was an article in the paper last Wednesday, USA Today, that there's a few government agencies that are banning it either campus-wide and other ones that are banning it within select sensitive areas.
Right. Right. Yeah, so it is being banned in various organizations, which is really interesting because here's a really cool technology where the security is so poorly implemented that it's unusable in some areas, unless you include something else on top of it. Did you know that most of the wireless network cards, if you take them apart, there's actually pinouts on the card, on the circuit board that's in that little antenna portion of the card, where you could solder your own antenna onto it? I saw some guys where they had done that. They'd taken the card apart, they'd soldered just an RCA connector on there, and then they had attached a 25 decibel gain antenna on it. They got about a 3-mile range on their 802.11b network. Then they put it in a van and took a slow drive through Boston and mapped out on a map all of the wireless networks that they found along the way. The SSID, if you remember back when wireless networks first came out, SSIDs were actually built as a security feature. You set an SSID and no unauthorized users can get to your wireless network. Yeah, right. WEP. WEP has its usefulness, in all honesty. The WEP stands for Wired Equivalent Privacy, which is a bunch of crap, because it's nowhere near that. But WEP is essentially an encryption mechanism designed to encrypt traffic that's going on the wireless network. It was a good idea, and it would have been a really good idea if it had been implemented by people who had half a clue about security. Some of the things they did was just incredible. First of all, they decided to use the RC4 protocol for the encryption. I don't know if you're familiar with how RC4 works, but basically, you take this key, the encryption key, you generate a key stream of zeros and ones, and then you XOR the plain text with that key stream, and that gives you the ciphertext. Okay? Well, if you take two ciphertexts that are XORed with the same key stream, and you XOR those, what do you get? You get the key. Okay? Cool. So all I have to do is find two pieces of ciphertext encrypted with the same key, and I now have the key, right? So how do we guard against that? Well, they guard against it by using something called the initialization vector, or the IV. And the initialization vector is added to the key stream to make the key stream different each time you use it. So how can we screw up the initialization vector? Well, for one thing, we can use a predetermined initialization vector. Like Lucent, on all of their cards, hard-coded them to use 1 as the initialization vector, numeral 1. That was their IV. When you started the computer, it used 1 as the IV. That's one way we can screw up. How else can we screw up? Well, we can use an initialization vector that's way too short. They used an initialization vector that was on the order of like 40 bits. Meaning that on a normal network, it would take you about 5 hours before you would start reusing keys. So if I just sniff 5 hours worth of traffic, I will eventually find the key. There's tons of ways you can screw this up, and they pretty much did it, all of them. Okay? So where is WEP actually useful? Well, it is useful in a network that's not going to be up for very long. If I wanted to protect the network here at Black Hat, WEP would be useful, because this network is only going to be here for about 3 days. And unless I'm using some really poor implementations of WEP, chances are it would take an attacker longer than 3 days to obtain the WEP keys. Okay? So in this case, WEP might be useful. In a corporate environment, it's useless. Absolutely useless, because you've got to remember the attackers have all kinds of time, and they can sit there and sniff traffic till the cows come home. Yeah.
Quick question. Now I understand that that's getting the web keys. What about just being able to decrypt the traffic? You should be able to do that much quicker.
No, the question is, what about decrypting the traffic? You should be able to do that much quicker. Well, you got to have the keys before you can do that. Depending on how the traffic is encrypted, there's two levels of WEP. There's three. There's a proprietary 56-bit implementation, but the public one is 40 bits, and then there's what they called 128-bit. My understanding is that it's actually 112. Now, 40-bit, we need to think about 40-bit encryption as plain text. Okay, and if we could just start doing that, I think we'd be a lot better off. There's people that actually think that the guys from the NSA that were just here this morning can actually read 128-bit in more or less real time too. Okay, but 40-bit doesn't take a whole lot of horsepower to crack. So with 128-bit or at least 112-bit, it's better, but not good. So there are improvements coming in the standard for wireless networking, but standards are problematic in the sense that we got to have enough infighting among the people that set the standards before they can actually come up with anything useful. And even then, it may not be useful. So, but there are some ways to do it. 802.1x is one way to do it. 802.1x is the authentication standard for wireless networking. Actually, 802.1x has absolutely nothing in particular to do with wireless networking. You can use 802.1x on a wired network as well. It's essentially meant to keep unauthorized people off the network. Unless you have the appropriate credentials, the switches won't let you even connect. I was at Boston University for a couple of years before I joined Microsoft, and we had a really interesting situation. In the building I worked, we had 4,000 network ports. Okay, we had a firewall. Unusual for a university, especially in Boston, but we did have a firewall. However, anywhere you sat down in this building, there was a network port. Okay, so all you'd have to do is take your notebook, walk up Commonwealth Avenue, walk in the building and sit down, and there's probably a network port and most likely a power jack too, so you don't have to run down your battery while you're hacking the network. Okay, so what good is that firewall going to do if I can just walk right into the building and connect right up to the network? Wireless networking extends that so that now the harder part, especially in Boston, would actually be finding parking outside the building. Right? That's much harder than actually hacking the network. So, I don't know if there's anybody from Boston, but if you are, you'll understand that part. So wireless networking has kind of extended the range of your network to something that's more or less indefinite. And that's really making things interesting. Like I said, if we can assume that the network is hostile, we're partway there to at least coming up with a solution. But we need to start assuming that. We also need to stop thinking that, oh, I'm on the inside, I'm inside the corporate network, therefore it's not hostile. If NIMDA didn't take you out of that misconception, then I don't know what is. I brought up a new box on our network, and it was a box that I used for testing purposes. It was a completely clean Windows 2000 install. And I brought it up in VMware. I don't know if you use VMware, but I brought it up in VMware. And I needed to install the new VMware tools on it. Well, when I bounced the box and saved the settings that I did, as soon as I rebooted, I realized it had been NIMDA'd. It took about 3 minutes. Okay, it doesn't take any longer than that. We need to stop thinking that our corporate network is not hostile. It is. It is hostile. We need to start realizing that. And we need defense in depth. All right. Enough on data theft. Let's talk about aggregation. Aggregation is one of my favorite topics. It's combining useless information from 2 or more sources to make useful information. Anybody familiar with the U.S. intelligence coup on the Japanese attack on Midway Island during World War II? You've heard the story? It's a really neat story. The U.S. knew there was an attack coming in the Central Pacific. They didn't know where, but they knew there was an attack coming. The Japanese were using code words to describe where they were going to attack. So the intelligence office at underneath the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet decided to try something different. They contacted the commander at Midway and said, we want you to transmit a message in clear text that says that you're low on water and that you need more water. He couldn't figure out why, but he said, okay, sure, I'll do that. Transmitted this message. A couple of hours later, they intercepted an encoded Japanese message that had the code name that they'd been using all along for the place they were going to attack, saying, this code name is low on water. Bingo. We had the code name. We now know that they're low on water. We now know that they're talking about Midway, so they knew exactly now where the attack was going to happen. Took two pieces of information, aggregated them, and made something very, very useful out of it, and were able to prepare for the attack. We can do the same thing with data today. Think about it. If I have a corporate HR database that contains employee IDs and salaries, employee IDs are not very useful to me as an attacker because I don't know who the employees are. But if I can also steal the mapping of the employee IDs to employee names, that's useful. Now I can combine those two and make really useful information out of it. Sales data, you can do the same thing. How do we guard against that? Separation of privilege. Separation of privilege. Making sure that one user doesn't have read access to both of these pieces of information. If you segregate the data such that we don't keep all of the critical pieces in one place, you also need to separate the privileges required to read that data. And that's really, really, really important. Don't download both pieces to this. Obvious reasons. Be careful about using code names. Like the World War II story it teaches us. We use code names to denote all kinds of interesting projects and so on. Be careful about how you use them because they may actually give away the project if you use them in the wrong context. ICCs are really, very, very susceptible to this type of attack because they're not protected by the corporate firewall. It's much easier to get the data off of one of these things. So that's aggregation. Software tampering is basically our traditional type of viruses. It's the most well-known form of tampering. It's where I compromise the integrity of the software such that the software does my evil bidding rather than what it's actually supposed to do, or maybe in addition to what it's supposed to do. Okay? Now, on a real workstation, this may not be as bad because we all run as unprivileged users, right? Right? No, okay. Okay, well, if you're running your standard productivity application as an administrator, you've got a problem. Because if I manage to compromise your standard productivity applications, guess what? I now have admin access to your box, right? But at least on workstations, we have supposedly anyway, the ability to run as adult privileged users. What about on these guys? What about on your home computer? How many home users, how many employees do you think run as a low privileged user on their home computer? It's pretty inconvenient. You know, if you can't use Microsoft Money without being an administrator, if you can't play Doom without being an administrator, most likely they're going to run as admins. Okay, so the edge devices of your network all of a sudden are all running as admins. One of the other things that people seem to keep forgetting for some reason is if you've had a serious software tampering attack, take NIMDA, take Code Red, one of those things, where the computer is no longer doing what it's supposed to be doing, it's doing something else, how do you clean up from that? What's the appropriate way to clean up? You flatten the box, right? Reformat, reinstall. Oh, but that's painful. Can't we just remove the virus? How? How can you trust what's on that machine? If you go to a command prompt and do a DIR, how do you know that what you're seeing on the screen is actually what's there? If I rooted your box, I can replace the system binaries, and you can no longer even trust the tools that's on that box. If you've ever administered Unix systems, you know that it's not a bad idea to have a /user/sbin copy on a CD. Then if you have a box that's been rooted, you mount the CD and you run all your tools from there rather than from /user/sbin. That's not as easy to do with Windows, unfortunately. We don't make that as easy to do. It's something that probably needs to be done, okay? Because once the box has been rooted, you have no control over it any longer, and you can't trust the software that's on there, okay? ICCs exacerbate this problem because even if they do have a concept of users and privilege levels, they're often not used, like I said. People don't do that at home. And many of these intermittently connected clients have no concept of that at all. There is no concept of user identification. And if there is no concept of user identification, there is no concept of separation of privilege. So a software compromise is going to be absolutely devastating to one of these things. I haven't seen that on one of these yet, but 4 or 5 years ago, we were saying that I have never seen a remote shell compromise of an NT box either. We've seen that today, right? 4 or 5 years ago, the most serious compromise of an NT box was a DOS attack. That's changed. Chances are this is going to change too. Okay? Also, remember that while the machine is disconnected from your network, while it's not under the protection of your firewalls and all your other corporate security measures, it's much more easily compromised. Home computers are usually not very well protected. So I can compromise the machine while it's disconnected. Eventually, it's going to be reconnected to the network. What happens then? I can probably spread that compromise to the rest of the network. That's vectoring. I've taken control of one edge device. I can now vector from that edge device right into the rest of the network. Okay? This can get very, very, very ugly. Why should I beat my head against your firewall? Why should I beat my head against the encryption of your VPN? When if I find the right employee who's running with blank admin passwords on his home computer, I can use his computer to connect right into the company. So you got this firewall, which is a 50-foot high wall. We need to start realizing that it's only 4 feet wide, right? All I have to do is take 2 steps this way, and I'm right through that firewall. So that's something to remember. Once I'm on that network, the potential for damage is basically unlimited. And the other thing is, as the devices get more powerful, the opportunities for vectoring increase. These things, as it turns out, are pretty hard to compromise right now because they expose basically no server functionality. Okay? As they start exposing server functionality, then they start exposing opportunities for compromise, and then they start becoming better vectoring targets. Right now, home computers are the best vectoring targets. Okay. There's a lot of home computers that actually route internet traffic through the VPN connection. That's pretty frightening. So they dial into the company, and then they route the kids' computer's internet connection through your VPN. Okay? That's not good. That's not good. Talking about VPNs, we need to remember that there are additional entry points into the organization. They fuzzy the edge of the network tremendously. It makes it very, very difficult to determine where the edge of the network is. Do you control all the entry points to your network? Do you even know where they are? Chances are you don't. Chances are you don't. We may be able to war dial and find modems. And one of my favorite measures against rogue modems is just install a digital phone system. That does a real good job of frying modems. But VPNs is much harder to do. Most of the ICCs have no firewalls, or the firewalls are very, very limited. Okay. Most of these personal firewalls are good. I like personal firewalls, don't get me wrong. I think it's a great idea. I think every machine should have one, and it should always be up. But are they very sophisticated? No, not really. There are still personal firewalls where if I just set the ACK bit on the packet, it will go right through it. Great way to port scan machines through a personal firewall is just send them a SYNAC packet. A Windows machine that's listening on that port will send you back a reset. Okay? If the personal firewall doesn't block SYNAC packets that are unsolicited, you're going to get resets back from that machine. I just port scan right through the firewall. That works on Tiny, for example. It works on, I believe it works on Zone Alarm. It does not work on the one that's built into XP. It actually does not work on the firewall built into XP. It's one of the things we did right. Also, many of the intermittently connected clients are using internet connection sharing. I talked about that earlier. We need to remember that it's not just the machine that's dialing into your network that is on your network. It's other things that are on the same network as it. Okay? That's an interesting thing to think about. Reading email on a PDA, cell phone type of thing, that enables an opportunity for vectoring. If I can get a hold of that machine, I can probably get into your email system. I can start sending emails to people. Talked about rogue modems. How many of you are really, really, really scared about peer-to-peer networking? Why not? This is one of those things that should send cold chills down your spine. Do you know how Gnutella works? A Gnutella net? This is really cool. You got a machine on the inside of your network, right? It's protected by this firewall. Nobody can make connections into it, okay? But that machine has made a Nutella connection to another machine on the outside, okay? This third machine on the outside can now go through the other outside machine and then tunnel through the connection that was made outbound and now become an insider on your network. They're designed to do that. They're designed to break down firewalls and break down network barriers. That's what they're designed to do. Any IT manager should realize that peer-to-peer is essentially kind of the rogue type of networking that we had 10 years ago where we had no centralized control. If we don't have centralized control, we lose the security aspects of it. Peer-to-peer frightens me. It really frightens me a lot. And this is one to think about. So your employees take good care of their computers, right? What about their kids? Do they have a computer that's connected to the same home network as your employees' computers? Do they take as good care of it? Probably not. Probably not. So that's one of the things to think about. All right, so that kind of outlines the general classes of problems that we can have with these intermittently connected clients. What can we do to protect against them? Okay, one thing would be to get the screen up. I have no idea what just happened here. Yeah, this has got to be a Microsoft feature. Resume slideshow. That would be a good thing to do if I can find my mouse. There it is. I love Toshiba. One of the problems I've been having with this machine is that as soon as the fan kicks on, the machine wedges, and the fan kicks on about every 3 minutes. So this is really interesting. I have no idea. At least I'm in good company. I heard even Bill Gates' computer crash one time when he was doing a presentation. Yeah, it is not liking me at all today. I'm going to give it a minute and see if it actually decides to come back to me, and if it does, then that would be happiness. Let's see, something happened here. Do I have a mouse? No, I don't have a mouse. I'd hate to bounce it at this point. I think what we probably should do is just keep talking, because if this is going to come back, it's going to come back, and if not, then well, we've got slides printed out, so, and they haven't changed. We'll see if it decides to actually be cooperative. On protecting these things, and I guess this is one of the machines that need to be protected. There really is no good answer. There's a lot of little pieces that we can do. Better authentication is one. Using smart cards for dial-in, okay? And actually, this is one that's kind of interesting. Blank passwords. As it turns out, blank passwords on Windows XP are probably better than 95% of the passwords that people are going to pick on their own, if left to their own devices. That's a frightening thought, but the reason is because if an account has a blank password set, that account cannot be used from the network. It cannot be used to map shares, it cannot be used for terminal services, it can really not be used for anything unless you're at the console. Now, if you think about the type of passwords that people would pick if they just get to pick on their own, right? Things like password, or password with a 0 instead of the O. Or the really good one, capital P-A-S-S-W-O-R-D, bang. That's a real good one, right? It has all of the required entropy. So, seriously, blank passwords are actually not that bad of a thing in Windows XP, which is kind of interesting. So better authentication, better passwords, using passphrases. One of the things I like to teach people when I try to teach people how to pick good passwords is pick a phrase, okay? And then take, the first or second letter of each of the words in that phrase. and then do some conversions, converting them to various kinds of weird characters and so on. That gives you a much, much, much stronger password than if you just were to pick one out all of its own. More security awareness on the ICC platforms, authentication, access control. Right now, these things have basically no access control whatsoever. Notebooks do, and in this case, the notebook isn't going to be giving up any information to anybody since it's not working anyway. But just more awareness of security on those platforms. Better authentication control at the entry points. I just already talked about that. How about Hardrick Compromise protection? Locking devices, cables. How about these alarms? Have you seen those for notebooks that you can attach to it and it gives off this piercing sound? Do those things actually work, or is it like car alarms? Oh, there's a car alarm that's going off. I think I'll ignore that. It's like 4 guys standing there with crowbars. I don't know. Tracking devices, I've seen those now. Those are kind of interesting. There was actually I think there's actually a company that makes a tracking device now that will wipe your hard drive remotely. I thought that was kind of cool. You call them up and say, my computer has been stolen. Oh, okay, we'll send out this signal that just completely wipes your hard drive. That's kind of cool. I'd like to hack that company. And then fire that, right? Gee, who don't I like? Zap. Right? just see the economy fall over like this. How about disguise? Do you put your notebook in one of those really nice leather Targus cases that has a big sign on it that says, "Steal me"? Right? I travel quite a bit with, because I do a lot of sports shooting, so I travel with firearms quite a bit. And it used to be, which was great, you get to the airport and you check in your gun, and they used to put a big orange sticker on the case that says firearm. Okay, why don't you just say "Steal me" on it? Wouldn't that be better, right? Now at least they put it inside. Much better idea. Get yourself a crappy looking backpack. Stick your notebook in that, and then dress like you really are a college student. And chances are somebody's much less likely to try to steal it, right? If you put your notebook in a $200 leather case, then it's probably more likely to get stolen. It's security by obscurity, but hey, whatever works, right? Just vigilance. I personally love this one about the Windows 95 notebooks. We give all our salespeople Windows 95 notebooks. And we all know the salespeople are the most security conscious people in the business, right? Right. So then we put very secret, sensitive corporate information on these machines, and then we send them out of the company with them to leave them at the Burger King at the airport. That's great. That's great. Or how about the guys that when they go through the security checkpoint at the airport, they take their notebook out of the case, they send that through first, then they take their jacket off, they put their cell phone in their pocket, they get rid of their wallet, they do all these things. The notebook's sitting on the other side by then, right? How long is it sitting there unattended? Those kinds of things are just kind of common sense measures to guard against hardware compromise. There's also the conventional type of protection, access control list, firewalls, physical security, authentication. This kind of weak password protection that we have on these things really needs to be improved. We really need better password protection. There's some third-party tools you can buy that actually will put passwords on information on these things. And it's really cool because they usually store the password in the registry on these in clear text. It's kind of pitiful. That's one of those things that needs to be done better. I would personally love to see if we could do fingerprint recognition on these. So in order to be able to use it, you have to be an authenticated user, and the way you authenticate is you put your thumb right on the screen and it reads your fingerprint. That'd be kind of cool. Give us some kind of access control on these machines. There is one other thing which I came up with, which I thought was kind of an interesting concept, and this is my straw man model for security. And this is dealing with the information itself. So conventional protection, hardware compromise protection, and all those things can protect against certain classes of things, hardware theft, et cetera. But how do we protect against data tampering? How do we protect against data theft? How do we protect against aggregation? And I thought about the value of information. It's one of those things that having worked in the academic field of information systems, is one of those things that really is important to us, was value of information. Think about it. The stock price for Microsoft on April 3rd this year would be really, really interesting to me today, right? Be really cool. I'd love to have that. How interesting is the stock price for Microsoft a week and a half ago? It's not very interesting, right? So the value of that information decreases as time goes by. If I can get a hold of your earnings report 2 days before it's released, that would be great. 2 days after it's released, it's not very valuable any longer. I call that intrinsic decay. The value of the information decays over time. Now the question is, can I make the value of information decrease by inducing decay on it? Can I use essentially extrinsic decay to protect information? And I think you can. I think you can. You can introduce this type of decay by some kind of a controlling authority. For example, your SQL Server database might be able to define that this data can be used X number of times, or once it's downloaded from the database and replicated onto one of these things, you can use it for 4 days. If I'm going on a business trip for 4 days, there's no particular reason why that information should be available any longer than 4 days, right? So how do I make that happen? How do I operationalize this type of decay? First thing that needs to happen is the data must be available only through a well-controlled channel. The only way I can get to that information should be this way. It's got to go through particular programs, the only way I can read it. That's number one. This channel can encrypt the data using a symmetric key, the data encryption key. And you can replicate that key onto the device. However, before you replicate it onto the device, you encrypt it using a public-private key system, okay? And then you store the private portion of that key on the device as well. So when I go to access the information, I say, first of all, check, is the information supposed to still be available? If yes, go ahead and retrieve the private key, decrypt the data encryption key, decrypt the information, and let me access it. And if it says, for example, if the policy, for example, says you can use it 4 times, I would tick off one more time that it's been used, right? What if the data should no longer be available? Let's say that the time period has lapsed and it should no longer be available. The channel should then see that and delete the private key from the system. If I just delete the private key from the system, I can no longer get to the data because I can no longer decrypt the data encryption key. Okay? And I had a really cool slide with a picture of that, and my computer is still completely wedged, so I can't show you that, but it's in the book if you look at it that way. You got this big server, you got some kind of a data, you run through an encryption algorithm, you get this encrypted data, you store that onto the client. You take the data encryption key, encrypt that using some public key. You take that encrypted data encryption key, store that on the client, and you also take the private key, store that on the client. And the beautiful part is there's only one piece that you have to delete from the client to basically make the data unavailable. The other neat part is if you then need to release that data, instead of renew the lease on that data, you need to keep accessing it. You can reconnect to the network and renew the lease for another time period or another X uses or whatever. And all the server needs to do is to propagate the private key down to the client again. Okay. It's actually kind of similar to some of the digital rights management techniques that are being used. But it's one way that we could potentially protect data on one of these machines. I cannot solve all of the problems with intermittently connected clients. I can't do that, at least not right now. But I can at least come up with a straw man that gives us a starting point for where we can solve it. These intermittently connected clients is a very, very serious issue. It's a very serious problem. It's a new problem, one that we haven't dealt with before. We're used to having well-defined networks, well-defined boundaries, and we no longer have that. And that's an important part. Mobile computing is certainly not going away. It's only going to get bigger. Okay? And mobile computing all of a sudden means that we need to think about our what we thought was our friendly network as essentially hostile from now on. Okay? And we need to develop new tools to protect our organizational assets, protect our data, protect our systems from these mobile computers that can be compromised when they're not connected. That was all I had to talk about. I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any. Yeah.
Thinking about some of the new
The question is, there's new types of software that available on PDAs and even web-enabled cell phones, which will monitor usage of information and can actually wipe the device. It can do a hard reset on it if you haven't used it for a certain period of time, or if you have tried to access the data too many times, etc. Those are all good things. The problem with it, obviously, is one, obviously, in the implementation. Most of the security software that I've seen for these devices have not been particularly sophisticated in terms of how they work. It's really funny because a lot of the companies that make security software for these devices think that storing encryption keys in the registry in clear text is a good place to put them. Okay? And unfortunately, there is no secured store on these things. On your notebook, if it's running NT or 2000 or XP, there is a secure store. There's a secure way to actually store stuff on that machine. There isn't on these. So that is a problem with that software. The other obvious issue is that destroying data could be used as a denial of service attack, right? If I wanted to really wedge you up, I can try to hack your system, hack it enough times so that it hard resets itself, and then you can't get to your data either. So that's obviously another issue. But in some cases, that may be better than letting me get access to it. So I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it's a good start. It's not the be-all and end-all solution to it, but it's definitely a good start. And it's nice to see that we're starting to get a marketplace for that type of software. I think that's very, very useful. Just the fact that people are starting to sell it, starting to use it, that's good. That's just goodness. That's apple pie. Yeah?
Can you kind of provide some insight on the class of attacks you expect to see on these mobile devices? I mean, I keep hearing that it's going to come any day now. I think this is a great presentation on how you can tunnel into the corporate network and do things, but do you think the device itself will become attacked? Like, I'll have my cell phone and I'll try to take down a cellular network or do something malicious on the device itself.
Do I think that the devices themselves will become attacked? I think they will eventually. There's some interesting things going on with the current crop of attacks, if you look at it. Like I said, about 4 or 5 years ago, for those of us who were in anti-security at the time, mostly what we saw were DOS attacks. There was the ping of death, which was very fun. There was teardrop, there was land, there was all of these types of attacks, and they were basically DOS attacks. That was the coolest thing I could do, was blow up 200,000 machines with a single box. Okay, I call it stupid DOS tricks, but that's what we saw. The attacks gradually got more sophisticated, and nowadays DOS attacks are kind of out of vogue. Being able to DOS a machine is not all that interesting, it's not all that fun. It's still a serious issue if I DOS your Exchange server or something like that. But it's much more fun to get a remote shell on it, right? So attacks have gotten more sophisticated as we have learned more about how the systems work, as we have learned more about what we can do with them, and as the systems have gotten more powerful. NT didn't have any remote shell capabilities. When NT 3.1 came out, there was basically no remote shell capabilities. Some people argue there were no capabilities, period, but I wouldn't go quite that far. But it had no remote shell capabilities. But XP has that stuff built in. It's got terminal services built in. Now all of a sudden you've got a really powerful remote shell there. Okay, and there are other ways to make remote shells even if there aren't any by default. If you haven't seen it, you need to go take a look at PSXSec from sysinternals. It's a very, very cool tool. It's called PSXSec. PSXSec, it's from System Internals, www.sysinternals.com. It's a very cool tool. It allows you to launch processes remotely. You can launch a command shell remotely and it will pipe both standard in, standard out, and standard error back to your machine. It's very, very cool. So the attacks have gotten more sophisticated. Currently, when it comes to intermittently connected clients, we're mostly seeing attacks on home computers because they have those kinds of capabilities. Are we going to start seeing attacks on these? I've already seen DOS attacks on these. One of the things that when I was reading in news media, and it's hard to get the accurate story from news media, but there were attacks on the networks that were using these at the World Economic Forum last week. Every one of the attendees got one of these. And they did attack the network that used these to prevent them from actually being able to use it. So we were seeing some DOS attacks. So are we going to be seeing more sophisticated kinds of attacks on these? I bet we will. I can't tell you when, but I think we will. And I think as security professionals, we do well to be prepared for that. And we do well to think about how that could be done and how we can protect against it now, as opposed to the kind of reactive approach which we've seen in security for the last 15, 20 years. That's always been one of our problems in information security, is we've never done things until after the attacks have happened, right? Largely, that's why we still have TCP/IP. It's just too damn useful to be able to get rid of. But if we could get rid of it, I think we'd probably be a lot better off, right? So yes, I think we will, but the question is when. I don't know.
When you say if you have a laptop running NT or XP and you have a secure store,
Yeah.
do you mean with the EFS?
Well, there's the question is, on a laptop, for example, is running, say, XP, there's a secure store. Am I talking about the encrypting file system? To some extent, yes. I mean, I can use the encrypting file system. Now, if your machine is not in a domain, for example, if I steal your computer, EFS is going to have absolutely no effect whatsoever in stopping me. Because what happens is the alternate decryption key is stored on the computer. So if I have physical control of the computer, I can get the alternate decryption key, and then I can own all the data that's on it. So EFS has great advantages if you're in a domain, but if you're not in a domain, then it's not all that useful.
So you're saying a laptop with
But
XP running only has a secure store if it's in the domain and has EFS?
no, actually, that's not what I'm saying. But that's one of the secure stores. There's actually other secure stores too. There's APIs for storing information securely on the machine. The local security authority actually has what's called a protected store. And you can actually call it, you can take a little piece of information, you can call the LSA, and it will store it for you in an encrypted form, such that the only way to get to it is through the LSA. You see what I mean? It's not quite LSA secrets, but that's one of the ways to do it. LSA secrets is not the best way to do it because it's very limited in terms of the number of secrets you can store. There's only so many LSA secrets that you can use on the machine. But the LSA has other ways to store things securely. So there are APIs for storing things securely on the box. So if you need to store, for example, passwords, there are ways to do that in a secure fashion. That's what you're lacking here. There's no API for doing that properly on these. That's what I was talking about, much more so than EFS. Does that answer your question? Yeah?
In the end, though, like, if I get physical access, I still allow
If I have physical access to your computer, it's not your computer anymore. It's that simple, okay? I don't care what it's running. I don't care what operating system it's running. You could be running VMS, you could be running Unix, you could be running NT, you could be running anything. If I have physical access to the machine, it's not your machine anymore.
So
We just need to start realizing that.
So what scenario does having a so-called secure store on a laptop guard against that not having a secure store?
It guards against the kind of network attacks where I don't have physical access to the machine, where I cannot do unlimited kinds of things to it. Or let's say that you leave the machine up on the podium here and then go get a cup of coffee. If I destroy the machine in the process of getting to your information, that's fairly noticeable. But if you eventually will get the machine back and you will notice that what I did to it, those are things that this could protect against. Because I may not want you to notice that I stole your information, and I may have to destroy some things on the box to do so. You see what I'm saying? So there's scenarios where this is useful. And also remember, the number of attackers that can effectively compromise the encrypted stores, the protected stores, is fairly limited. It's going to stop a lot of people, right? So if we can stop 80% of the people by taking some fairly simple measures, then we can devote the rest of our efforts to the 20% of the people that we couldn't stop with those measures. So which is obviously very useful. So let's see.
In the peer-to-peer networking aspects, how much legal ramifications are you seeing coming out of, like, say, Sony Music and others that are going after corporations?
how much legal ramifications am I seeing coming out of like Sony Music going after corporations? Honestly, I'm not the best person to answer that because I try to stay away from legal issues as much as I can. It's going to be something that's going to be important. I mean, if your employees set up a GNU-telenet inside the company and start sharing music that way, that could get very ugly. That could get very, very ugly. It could get even uglier if they set up a GNU-telenet and start sharing dirty pictures.
I guess the question was more along the lines of quantitative versus the actual legal aspects of it. I know that Sony Music has started going after a few different corporations. That's one. That's why I go there. I didn't know
Oh, really?
if the other ones are going after them over IP.
I have not followed that, honestly. I really haven't. I just really can't answer it. I know there's going to be problems in that area. I mean, coming from academia, access to information was always the be-all and end-all. We just wanted free access to information. And a lot of the things that we designed were made for that, and they're now being used for things where that's not a desirable end. So that's going to have some interesting impact. I can't answer what else is going to happen there legally. Let's see. Yeah.
What about device duplication or like impersonation?
Yeah, device duplication. Okay, I like this concept. You know, it's like I said. If I can destroy the system, I can probably get to just about any information that's on it. But if I somehow need to turn the system back over to you without you noticing that I had access to it, that makes things much more interesting, right? So device duplication is an interesting way for the attacker to get around that. If I can get access to one of these, dupe it onto another one of these, then I can give you back this one and I can attack the duplicate. That's an interesting concept. I'm not sure exactly how to operationalize that from the attacker's perspective yet, but there may be things that we're going to start seeing. Most of these machines, these notebooks, it's fairly trivial to yank the hard drive out of it, right? If I can then put it in a disk dupe machine, put the hard drive back in, return the system to you, oh, yeah, I found this. It was sitting over at the Burger King. Did you lose that there? I'm really sorry. Well, at least I found it and not some bad guy, right? Snicker, snicker, snicker.
What about as a means of getting into the network? There's like a certain trust that some devices have.
Oh, sure. What about its means to getting into the network? Well, for one thing, it's going to give me all of the access points, right? And with 90% certainty, it's going to give me the passwords because we all check that checkbox says, never prompt me for the password again, right? Right. God, if we could just get rid of that checkbox. Please store my password for all future use. I did that with those little fingerprinting devices. It was really cool. The one I was talking about earlier. It has the ability to, you go to a web page. So I go to my bank's web page, and it's got the logon dialog. So please type in your account number and your password. Well, if you hit the little fingerprint device at that point, it pops up a message saying, would you like to store the credentials for this page? And you say, OK. So it gives you this interface with a username box, and you type your username, and then it gives you a password dialog. We can type your password, and it's protected by the stars and all that, so you can't see the password. So the next time you go to the web page, you hit your finger on the thing, and it puts your credentials in for you, hits enter, and logs you on. Really slick, right? If you have one of these, go into the management tool for those credentials one time. It will show you this website has this username and this password in clear text. The management tool actually shows you the password in clear text. So storing passwords on the system is one of those really, really bad practices which we can't seem to wean people off of. And really the only good way to solve that one is smart cards. We need to make it such that I don't need just the system. I need the system and something else to get into the network. Of course, that's not going to get rid of the problem where people take their smart card and they store it right in the smart card reader right here. That's not going to get rid of that problem, but it's a start, right? Unfortunately, as with much of information security, it has the distinct side effect that our job as information security professionals is to restrict access to things. It's to make stuff difficult to get to. It's to limit what you can do, right? Our job as IT administrators is to make technology totally ubiquitous. It's to make stuff show up without people having to think about it. It's to make things work. I've done a lot of system administration. I spent a long time doing system administration, and I don't think I have ever gotten a phone call from anyone to say, you know, I just want to tell you the network is running great today. Printer works, I can get to all my files, the email works. It's just awesome. I just want to let you know. I've never gotten a phone call like that. Not once in 12 years. The phone calls I get is, you idiot, get in here. Those are the phone calls I get. If your name shows up first in their Rolodex, you're in trouble, right? That's when you know you need to start working on your resume. So, but those are really orthogonal goals. They're not really compatible. As an IT admin, my job is to make technology accessible. As a security administrator, my job is to restrict access to technology. Okay? It's to make stuff harder to use. I don't know where the trade-off, where the good trade-off lies in that. I really don't. Part of it relies on contextual security. You have more security in some contexts than in others. But if I can break out of the context, I can break out of that sandbox. So it's not a perfect solution either. I don't know where the answer lies. But it's something to think about as a security administrator. It is definitely something to think about. I have a coworker who works over in the Windows division. His name is Michael Howard. I don't know if you've heard of him. He wrote an absolutely excellent book called Writing Secure Code together with another guy I work with, David LeBlanc. It's well worth reading if you haven't read it. But Mike's tagline on his email, his little signature says, got an access denied? Good, the security is working. So, any other questions, or is it lunchtime? I got 7 minutes before lunchtime. Why don't we beat the other people to the lunch table? All right, thank you.